Well, good evening, and thank you for being here this evening. My name is Holly McKiernan. I am the Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, and General Counsel for Lumina Foundation. And Lumina Foundation is incredibly proud to be a sponsor of this conversation this evening, which I am confident that we're all going to learn a great deal by sitting here tonight. At Lumina, for those of you who are not familiar with Lumina, we are based here in Indianapolis, and we have a very single targeted goal, and that is to increase the percentage of Americans with high-quality degrees, certificates, and other credentials to 60% by 2025. And in doing that work, our work is focused on closing attainment and enrollment gaps that are based on race and ethnicity. We often say that our intention, and we strive to have equity be our work. And so as we continue to try at Lumina to learn about how to, in fact, move this agenda in a strategic fashion, we are equally focused on trying to embed equity in what we do operationally. And we really want to think about what is our responsibility and stewardship role as far as being a philanthropic leader, to ensure that as a society we're having the kind of conversations around race and equity that we need to be having. And so it is with incredible pleasure that I'm glad that we have this conversation this evening and our esteemed guests to be able to help facilitate this conversation. I also have the privilege of serving on the Board of Visitors of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And the Lilly School is an incredible asset to both the field and to our city. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our esteemed Dean, Amir Pasek, and he will take us from here. Thank you, Amir.
Well, thank you so much, Holly, and thank you for being with us and for the wonderful sponsorship from Lumina Foundation, which is a wonderful asset also for our community here. So I want to add my welcome to our fourth event in the Mays Institute Speaker Series, and we have a special program for you and a truly distinguished speaker, a sort of homecoming for ABBFE in many ways that we helped incubate, as I understand, way back when in its early days on this auspicious birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. as well. I also want to thank the Rose Mays and the Mays family, Lacey Johnson and the Mays Institute Council of Advisors, the Board of Visitors of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and you, the members of our community, our extended family. Just a few words on the Mays Institute to give you some context if you're not familiar with it. The Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy fosters a greater understanding of the ways in which underrepresented people are both inspired and informed to be generous donors by providing knowledge, education, and training. The Institute seeks to understand the perceptions, practices, experiences, and needs of the individuals and institutions that generate philanthropy in underrepresented communities and develop programming and services to engage philanthropic practitioners, scholars, and the public at large in conversations and activities to advance the field. The Institute's inspiration, William G. Mays, began his nearly 50-year career in Indianapolis and provided outstanding local, national, and international leadership in the business, civic, and philanthropic sectors. The Mays Family Institute is a tribute and celebration of his legacy. The Institute honors the philanthropic values of Bill and his wife Rose to provide the community with a space for public inquiry, hands-on training, and the study of generosity within historically underrepresented groups. Like our school's other institutes, the Mays Institute is an integral part of the school. And like Lake and the Women's Philanthropy Institute, it is emerging as a significant resource for the field of philanthropy in Indiana, nationally and beyond. We have already done research that looks at the consequence of increased diversity on nonprofit boards, and there is much more to come. Indeed, it is the questions and the curiosity that we bring to the table that will make the Institute a vital partner to endeavors in the sector that wrestle with the urgent imperative of inclusion in our society. Finally, since you have joined us in this journey with the Mays Institute, I want to take a moment to highlight subsequent visitors who will help enrich our dialogue this academic year, and I ask you and welcome you to join us. Our next speaker will be Noah Dresner. he will be speaking on LGBTQ philanthropy, and he will be joining us at the New Strata location in downtown Indianapolis. After Noah Dresner, we will have our final speaker, who will be Sandy Vargas, formerly of the Minneapolis Foundation, and she will be speaking at the NCAA Hall of Champions on April 24th. I hope you will join us. And now, it is my pleasure to invite to the podium the leader of the Mays Institute, our Dean's Fellow, Professor of Economics and Philanthropic Studies, and Associate Dean for Research and International Programs, Dr. Una Ossoly.
Good evening and welcome. We're honored, delighted, and just excited about this evening. We spent a lot of time planning, thinking about this event, but now the moment is here, and my job is just to introduce the two people who are the stars of this evening, my colleague, Dr. Tyrone Freeman, who many of you know, as well as one of our new colleagues, newest colleagues actually, Susan Batten, who we're welcoming into our larger Lilly Family School family tonight. Official welcome to you. So I'd like to take a moment and just read their bios and then turn it over to Dr. Freeman, who will lead the discussion. But I encourage all of you to think about your questions, the comments you have, ideas you have, and we will have an opportunity for the audience to engage in this conversation. So let me start by introducing Dr. Freeman. Dr. Tyrone Freeman is an award-winning scholar and teacher who serves as an assistant professor of philanthropic studies. He's also the director of undergraduate programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. His scholarly research focuses on African American philanthropy in historical and contemporary contexts. In fact, he has a new book that's forthcoming on Black women's philanthropy during the Jim Crow era, titled The Philanthropic Life of Madam C.J. Walker, which is under review and will be coming out in 2020. Is that correct? We're already planning a celebration in 2020. Okay, so a lot to be said about Tyrone, but you're going to really enjoy his thoughtful questions and engagement this evening. And let's turn to our speaker. We've had the pleasure of spending the whole day with Susan, and you're going to understand very shortly why she's such an important voice in philanthropy today. I'm just going to read a little bit of her bio, and then you'll hear from her directly. Susan Taylor Batten joined ABFE as president and CEO in January 2009. So she's been at ABFE for nearly 10 years now. The Association of Black Foundation Executives, as you heard earlier, was actually incubated here in Indianapolis many years ago, nearly 50 years ago. And ABFE's mission is to promote effective and responsive philanthropy in Black communities, and counts among its members some of the most influential staff, trustees, and donors of grant-making institutions in the United States. Under her leadership, ABFE has expanded its base of programming and membership across the country. In fact, what we learned this morning is ABFE's work has really taken off in the last few years, and they are experiencing sort of an inflection point in terms of interest in the programs and outreach that they're engaged in. Prior to joining ABFE, Susan was a senior associate with the Anna E. Casey Foundation. At Casey, Susan served as staff in the Community Change Initiatives unit, which provided investments to help transform neighborhoods into family-supportive environments. She also coordinated a portfolio in equity, diversity, and inclusion, where she worked across the foundation to strengthen its focus on addressing racial disparities. Her duties also included assisting Casey in its efforts to build and employ equitable and inclusive management and administrative practices, including workforce diversity, grantee diversity, and vendor practices. Prior to working in philanthropy, Ms. Batten held leadership positions in both federal and city government. Her accomplishments are so many, but I just want to mention one last area. She's the co-founder of the Race and Equity in Philanthropy group and serves on the board of the United Philanthropy Forum. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Political Science from Fisk University. Actually, both Susan and Tyrone are proud HBCU graduates. I thought I should mention that. and her Master's of Social Work degree from Howard University in Washington, D.C. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tyrone. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan Batten, thank you for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here. Now I realize why I'm so tired as you were reading all of what's before this. Yeah.
Great. So, struggle and progress, a big topic. I want to start by thinking about some of your background.
Yeah.
In many ways, philanthropy is universal. All cultures have traditions of giving and sharing.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, it's intensely personal.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to talk about your personal story with philanthropy. What role did philanthropy play in your childhood and upbringing?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for being here. I want to thank the Institute and the school. It's been a great day so far. You know, philanthropy was very central to my family. I often say that my mom and dad were part of the village. And, you know, in our culture, as it relates to the African American community, we often, you know, use the quote, "It takes a village to raise a child." And my parents were very much a part of the village. My dad, I'm going to call his name, Eugene Taylor, was a lifelong teacher and taught history and social studies in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is a pretty tough neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. And when he wasn't teaching school, he was running youth centers at night in Brooklyn. And on the weekends, actually, my father and his friends, who were other black male teachers, would actually run homework clubs in our basement. And so there was never any, you know, ever getting away from studying and homework, because my home was the home that all the kids came to in the neighborhood and could get the mentoring and support, you know, by teachers, folks in the educational arena. My mom was a community health nurse, and she worked in Wyandanch, Long Island. I'm born and raised in Long Island, New York, and I believe raised generations of families in this one community health center, helped to raise generations of families. My mom was the Girl Scout troop leader. My mom was the Parent-Teacher Association leader. My dad was the Cub Scout leader. So that was their philanthropy. They spent a lot of their time not only raising us, I'm one of four, but opening up our home and using all their time to support other kids in the community. Yeah.
Okay, and you had a sibling who was involved in some interesting activities too.
Yeah, I often say that I learned a lot from my parents as it relates to giving back and philanthropy. My sisters were also instrumental in my life. I learned something else from my sisters. I learned about giving back, but also taking back. My sisters were very active in the Black Panther Party. And they instilled in me sort of a sense of social justice and ways in which we need to take care of our own people and our own community. It's so interesting. There's 10 years between myself and my oldest sister, Pat, who's now transitioned, but she was the more radical one. And I'll never forget, she actually would come home from Brown University in a green Volkswagen bus that was painted with fists and afros on the side. It was called the Afro bus. And they would pull up, and my dad and my mom just used to faint, and I thought it was so cool. I thought it was so cool. I could never figure out why they were always so mad. They were always so mad. But after learning about this work and understanding about the importance of social justice, I understand why they were mad. So the notion of giving back and philanthropy very much instilled in my parents, but my sisters also taught me about social justice and activism. Yeah.
And what about faith in that upbringing?
You know, it's interesting. We weren't, everything in my family was pre-Susan and post-Susan. And I think, again, that's because I was the last of four, and there are 10 years between the oldest and the youngest. And so by the time I came around, as they would describe it, by the time Susan came around, you know, my family wasn't a church-going family per se. My parents actually really sort of supported all of us in exploring faith and religion and spirituality on our own. And so I, with my friends and community members, would attend church. I ended up going to a Lutheran high school of all high schools. But it wasn't until really my early adult years, and I think once I got to Fisk University, that I started to draw on a higher power. I started to draw on faith and really understood the importance of believing in something so strongly that helps get people through, particularly our community through.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that HBCU magic.
Yes.
You went to
Yes.
Fisk,
Yes.
and you went to Howard.
I did.
And very important places in your life story.
Yeah.
And a big part of your formation.
Yeah.
And so why Fisk?
You know what's so funny? First, I have to point out my classmate right here, Angela Neely. We graduated from Fisk together. And I haven't seen AJ in so many years, but we are both dear Fisk daughters. It was so sporadic how I got there. I was going to the University of Kentucky, and I will be very candid because I loved basketball. and none of my sisters or my brother went to an HBCU. My parents didn't, my grandparents did, because that's where, you know, folks of their generation basically had to go in terms of choice. And at the last minute, before I went off to Lexington, Kentucky, the university wrote and said they didn't have sufficient housing for incoming freshmen, and I was going to have to live off campus freshman year. My dad was not having it. He was like, no way. And the next week, I went to a college fair, and I picked up a brochure that said Fisk. And it was that random. I'd like to think now that it was not random at all. That was, you know, the spirits actually calling me to the university, but it wasn't a planned decision, but that's how I got there. Yeah. Yeah.
And what did being there do for your development?
You know, going to Fisk, and I should say, I mentioned I went to a Lutheran high school, which was not diverse by the time I graduated. It started out as being a very diverse high school, but by the time I graduated, predominantly white. Going to Fisk was a huge transition for me. I had also never been South before, born and raised in New York, and my mom was from Jersey and my dad was from Philly. And so we didn't venture south much. And I remember showing up in Nashville, Tennessee with my mom, being in the airport and country music blasting through the PA system, and never will forget walking through the airport and in the gift shop seeing little black figurines pushing bales of cotton, and I thought, wow, this is going to be interesting. But more than anything, Fisk really taught me about who we are as a people, the struggle and the progress. It helped shape my political ideology, and now when I look back, I realize that it was most important for me because it helped build a sense of racial pride. I was not a good student in high school, and by the time I got to college, really was in remedial everything. If you name it, remedial, I was in it. By the time I graduated from Howard, magna cum laude, and I truly believe it's because I was in institutions that celebrated my strengths and the strengths of our people. And many of you may know there's a lot of literature and research that suggests that particularly for black youth, racial pride actually is a protective factor, right? That actually helps young black kids deal with racism, you know, discrimination, and the like. And I think I've experienced that. Those universities were extremely important in helping build racial pride and helping me just navigate, I think, life as I moved on in my career.
Okay, so after you graduated, you held positions at Annie Casey Foundation.
I did.
You worked in the city government of DC as well as in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Right. So let's talk about your transitions through this period and into the world of foundations. Yeah. How did that start for you?
You know, it's interesting. I often say that I'm a social worker by training. I got my master's in social work from Howard and started out in foster care in Washington, D.C. You know, it's what my family did. All of my family, my parents, my two sisters, my brother took a different path, but most of us were in helping professions, right? My sisters were teachers, my dad was a teacher, my mom was a nurse. And so in a way, I think my career chose me. I didn't necessarily choose my career. but I went into social work, and that lasted for about 6 or 7 months, being in direct service as relates to social work, because I was really interested in the design and impact of public programs and public policy in particular. So I transitioned very quickly out of direct services and give all props to social workers and folks that work every day with families. But I was very interested in the impact of programs and programs that were broken and how you fix them and the like. And so started doing more children's policy work in the government of, at the time, Marion Barry, one of the first black mayors of a major city, which was really important to my development as well, was in leadership at that point. I moved on to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. You want to talk about a non-diverse place to be. USDA has one of the worst records, right, of diversity in the federal government. It did. This is probably back in the, early 90s, late 80s. It still doesn't have. In the history of black farmers. Yeah, in the history of black farmers. I mean, we can go on and on. I went to the Food and Nutrition Service. Again, with an interest in social policy research, public policy research, and managed federal evaluations, national evaluations of child nutrition programs. So I was managing research on like school lunch programs, school breakfast program, the WIC program, and the like. And I was pretty cool at USDA. I was in public service. I thought that would be my career. That's what a lot of our people did in terms of, moving up. I was a grade 12, I was fine, I wasn't gonna go anywhere. And I got tapped by a search firm to move into the field of philanthropy. And that was the transition point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we know from research that people of color in the foundation world find themselves in that position because of their concerns over racism and sexism. They see themselves as change agents for that. So what are some of those formative experiences as you were tapped by the search firm that kind of led you to say, okay, I'm open to this.
Well, it's interesting. My mom thought I was crazy because I was leaving my good government job, right? Yeah. And again, that's what my family, many of the elders in my family did. You actually, sort of got yourself into the middle class and sustain your life through government, which is why, side note, the impact of this shutdown and its disproportionate impact on black people, we should all be very concerned about. But I made the transition, and I can remember explaining it to my mom, because as I was understanding more about the sector of philanthropy, I didn't know much about foundations prior to that. I thought that foundations had the opportunity to take risks, to use money in new and different ways, to be innovative. And so my transition actually was to a consulting firm that was sort of the back office for a number of national foundations. And there I learned a lot about the sector. I learned the good and I learned the bad. But some of the good really had to do with how bold the philanthropic sector, and particularly foundations, because that's been my work, can be, actually take risks, and don't have to be sort of caught within the sort of boundaries of public dollars, which was my background. Again, I was always about how do we fix big systems that touch, low-income communities, communities of color, and the foundation world seemed to be a place where you could test out new ideas and the like.
Okay, so you mentioned the good and the bad.
Yeah, right.
You said a little bit about the good. So what's wrong with grant making today?
Ooh, okay. What's wrong with grant making? I said something about the good, right? Okay.
You did.
Okay. I don't want to. Yeah.
Risk-taking, innovation.
Risk-taking, and I have to say, some of the earliest work I never thought, just to make this point, I never thought I would be focused on work around racism and equity. And some of the earliest work that I had the opportunity to do in this sector had to do with fighting racism through the leadership of the Levi Strauss Foundation, of all, a corporate foundation, again, back probably in the mid-90s, and at that point, led by Judy Bell, who was a black woman who now runs the California Wellness Foundation. So I lift that up because it was an example of the boldness that a corporate foundation was actually going to say it's not poverty but racism that's affecting communities of color and blocking opportunity for communities of color. So again, that's part of the good, the innovation and the risk-taking.
How was Strauss received when it started making that?
You know, it's interesting. I thought, so here we were, I'll never forget, I was actually managing the work in Valdosta, Georgia at the Levi's, and they have a plant in Valdosta, Georgia. And it ruffled feathers, big, big feathers, that a corporation, right, was so bold to say that racism existed, as if we didn't think it did, that racism existed, and that the corporate arm of, was going to actually help the communities in which it had plants look at racist housing policies, education policies, and the like. One day, and I keep encouraging Judy Bell to write, and led by a woman of color. So there are a lot of dynamics sort of bundled into this. Ruffled a lot of feathers. I remember people losing jobs. I remember tough conversations in mayor's offices. I was in around 5 cities around the country, but I thought this was great. Like, this is great, right? So that's the good, even though it's hard, that's the good about philanthropy and what foundations specifically do. The challenges, I think, have everything to do with the lack of accountability of foundations. When I was at the Center for Assessment and Policy Development, the consulting group that was doing back office work for foundations, I'll never forget, and this is actually one of the efforts that made me want to work in the sector. There is a particular large foundation, I'll leave the name out to protect the innocent, was making a huge commitment in about 7 states around the country to reform child serving systems, right? So this was at the state level, and it was working with grassroots and grass tops to talk about how we reform child serving systems to make them more culturally competent and impactful in all communities. And it was a 10-year effort, and probably around year 3, the foundation realized that it didn't quite have all the answers and decided that they were going to pull the plug, right? And unfortunately, it's a scenario that happens more than we'd like to think with foundations, that often they're testing ideas, but the fact is that they're engaging real people, and these are real lives that we're talking about, and when things get kind of messy, because change is not linear or easy, and often when foundation leaders can't create a theory of change around something, right, can't figure out how to measure it, they pull back. And so I'd say that the issues of accountability or lack thereof in the sector are some of the biggest challenges, some of the things that we want to change.
Okay. And as we think about ABFE in this context, can you tell us a little bit about the history of its founding and what was happening at that time that sparked its generation?
Yeah, so as Una said, we're going to be 50 in 2 years, the Association of Black Foundation Executives. And it was created in 1971. And I'd like to actually paint a picture for you in terms of the founding, because I love telling this story, because I love legacy stories, right? 1971, so, at that point, we're at the height of the Black Power movement, right? The Civil Rights movement sort of transitions into the Black Power movement. And there are a number of Black organizations that were founded right in that timeline. So imagine we are at the Council of Foundations meeting in 1971, and that's many of you may know, it's the big sort of umbrella association for foundations in this country. COF still exists today. And we're in Montreal, Canada. We're at the annual meeting of the council. And they're about to vote in new board members. And at that time, the entire council of foundation staff was white. The entire board of the council was white. And most of the 1,500 or so people in the room that day were white, except for 8 black foundation executives sitting right in the front row, as they say, making everybody a little nervous, right? Because they were all sitting in the front. You know, we all sit in the front together. Something's about to happen, right? Something's about to happen. I'll tell you, we have a YouTube video of the 6 founders that are still with us today telling the story, and it's hysterical, about how the night before they sat up with the bylaws of the Council of Foundations and a lot of wine and talked about how they were going to protest the vote for new members, new board members of the council. They had done their homework. They knew that the bylaws allowed for nominations from the floor. And so right at the time when the board was about to vote on the nominated new board members, all 8 Black Foundation executives stood up and just basically took over the stage and disrupted the business of the organization. And they submitted an alternative slate of candidates that had about 11 names of African Americans on it. And depending on who you ask, the story goes haywire at this point. Some folks have told me that half the names on that list weren't even real people, but nonetheless, they were able to get 2 African Americans voted onto the board of the council at that time, and that was actually the genesis of ABFE. Ambassador James Joseph was in fact the CEO of the Engine Cummings Foundation at that time, which is located here, and that's been our connection to Indiana. Our articles of incorporation are actually here in the state of Indiana. And the founding of ABFE actually led to, maybe 10 years later, the creation of groups like Hispanics in Philanthropy, the Women's Funding Network, and really opened the door for more people of color and women in particular to get onto the board of the council and push on the issues of diversity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what does ABFE's work look like today? Coming from that issue.
Yeah, so the founding mission of ABFE is to promote effective and responsive philanthropy in Black communities, and that is our mission today. And we have a framework on what we think effective and responsive philanthropy looks like, and I can talk about that a bit later. But our work really falls into 3 areas. The first is philanthropic advising. And so we do a lot of consulting and training with foundation boards and staff on, again, impactful grant making in Black communities. This is really work that comes from my work at the Annie Casey Foundation, where my job was to help that foundation really think about how to be more impactful in communities of color. When I left Casey, I brought that work to ABFE, and we now probably have touched 2,000 to 3,000 foundation professionals with our consulting and with our training on working in Black communities. It's interesting, Una mentioned again that our work has been growing lately, and it's really our consulting and advising work that's taken off. And you know, a lot of this is tied to really what's been happening around the country vis-a-vis the movement for Black lives. We started our consulting work probably back in 2011, 2012, but quite frankly, after Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, we have been called on in a big way to work with foundations around the country to be more impactful, be more respectful of Black communities, and to figure out sort of how to work with community in order to make grant making more responsive. So philanthropic advising is the first bucket. The second is just a body of work we call member and partner services. So we do a lot of networking with foundations that are interested in being impactful in Black communities. And I keep saying Black communities. I should say that the framework that we use is one that very much centers a structural racism analysis. And so this actually is an analysis that is relevant to all communities of color, right? When we think about how communities of color fare in this country. But networking is extremely important to ABFE. We run funder networks. We, for quite some time, ran a funder network on Black men and boys that actually led to the My Brother's Keeper work of President Obama. We now have a funder network on Black social change. These are funders that are investing in Black-led social change organizations that are about building power in Black communities. And, you know, again, networking being critically important because it's still the case that many of our members, and our members aren't just Black, most are, but many of our members are still the only person of color, let alone the only Black person in their foundation. So the demographics of foundations are of great concern to us, so that's why networking is really important. The last is research and advocacy in terms of the third area of work. So we actually, you know, stay focused on where the money's going from foundations, where the resources are going. It's still the case that less than 2% of grant dollars actually make it to organizations led by Black people and that are specifically designed to support and uplift Black communities. So we stay on the issues around advocacy as relates to who gets funded and also who gets to lead in the sector. So 3 areas of work with a lot of stuff going on.
Okay. Talk to us about why those networks, and particularly you mentioned Hispanics in philanthropy, the Blacks in philanthropy groups, why are those so important? There's some people that don't quite understand that or get that. How would you explain that?
You know, this work, when I you know, talk about the demographics, so just there are over 70,000 foundations in this country, right? And the data that we have suggests that less than 5% of foundation trustees are Black. Less than 7% of foundation CEOs are Black. And about 12% of program staff are Black. And that's actually a decline. And so working in institutions that are not demographically diverse is tough, particularly for people of color. And those are the numbers as it relates to African American representation. The numbers for Latino representation are much lower. Asian representation much lower. And Native, I haven't seen data, unfortunately, on Native participation in the foundation sector. And so retaining the talent is extremely important. I always say that I feel like we don't have a diversity issue in foundations in this country. We have an inclusion issue in foundations, and this is where we get into what we mean by all these words. But retaining the talent is extremely important. We have a fellowship program. We've got some alumni here, Tyrone and Alicia. I was in the first class of our ABBs Connecting Leaders Fellows program. It's often the case we get talent when they've been in the field for about 3 to 5 years. And it's usually the case that folks are about to leave the sector by the time they get to our fellowship. So after 3 to 5 years, it's like, I don't know if I can deal, you know, in this sector anymore. These institutions that don't understand and know my community. And so groups like ABFE, groups like Hispanics in philanthropy, Native Americans in philanthropy, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in philanthropy, we all really serve to ensure that not only can we retain the diversity in the sector, we're all watching the money in terms of where the resources are going, but they're critically important in terms of the infrastructure of the field.
Okay, so let's talk now about that framework, the Black-led, Black-centered social change. What is that?
Yeah, about 2 years ago, we partnered with the Hill Snowden Foundation, which is a family foundation in Washington, D.C., to release a report called The Case for Investing in Black-Led Social Change. And we really were riffing off of Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, The Case for Reparations. But it really lifted up the fact that when we think about wins, social justice wins in this country, civil rights wins in this country, they were very much reliant on strong Black-led civil rights organizations, social justice organizations that were about moving agendas that weren't just about wins for the Black community, but for communities of color at large, for women, for gay, lesbian, bi, trans communities, communities that were marginalized generally. And over time, these organizations have suffered from a lack of investment. As I mentioned, the data that we have, and we're waiting for the data to come out, but the latest data that we have, it's dated. It's probably about 2013 data, 2012 data, less than 2%, right, of funding going to organizations that are specifically about the uplift of Black people. There's also data that suggests, regardless of the focus on Black people, just funding going to social justice philanthropy is like 7%, 8% of all foundation grant making. We believe that we need a viable, strong infrastructure for social change. And we believe it should be Black-led at ABBE. It's not about, again, just wins for our community, but for all communities, like we've seen in the history of this country, where, again, groups were moving agendas that impacted all marginalized communities. So the paper that we put out really talks about the fragility of Black-led groups, and these are really groups that are about building power. This work is really about building power in Black communities, in marginalized communities, right? We want to see more dollars go to these groups. We actually have some national research out now where we're looking at just the fiscal health and well-being of Black-led social change groups around the country. Already the data's coming in. Most of you wouldn't be surprised that, you know, many of these groups, many of these Black-led groups that are about building power. So I'm talking about groups that are doing organizing, advocacy, civic engagement, right? Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without demand, never has, never will. It's about building power for our people. These groups are mom and pop shops, right? Working with, you know, 2 staff, a handful of volunteers, budgets under, you know, $500,000, no financial reserves. And we believe we all suffer if these organizations aren't strong and the like. So the case that we put out actually calls for an increase in funding to Black-led social change organizations. And again, this is about organizations that are doing organizing to build people power, civic engagement to build political power, organizations that are about building Black economic power, to change narrative about Black people and Black communities in this country. And we've got something in the works called the 25% campaign. So we're going to, over the next year, after we release the data, actually hit up the largest foundations in this country and want to see them increase their funding by at least 25% to Black-led social change groups. Those are about building power around the U.S.
Okay.
Yeah.
In that report, you wrote that bias against Black-led organizations has fed a false narrative about their worthiness and effectiveness for investment. So what is that bias, and how does it operate?
Well, you know, it's interesting. It's like this catch-22. Because of the lack of investment in Black-led groups, many of the groups are struggling, and just in terms of capacity, right? And this may be a narrative that is similar here in Indianapolis, but we'll hear foundations colleagues say, well, they don't have the capacity to take this grant, right? So we've got to get the grant to perhaps a organization that is not Black, but that's working in the Black community, because they don't have the capacity to take this grant. And that is a widely held narrative in the sector, that the infrastructure is fragile and weak, and it is because there hasn't been, you know, the history of investment. So again, we're actually trying to just sort of flip the script and put the blame on funders, actually, about why Black-led groups, and I would say this for Latino-led groups, smaller groups, newer to the scene, that are supporting immigrant populations in particular. These groups are small. The sector will say it can't handle, you know, large investments. But again, we believe it's because they haven't had the opportunity to receive dollars and build capacity over time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you implement your framework, you think about it from the grant maker side in terms of what they can do, but there's also the organizational side. So can you give us a couple of examples of how Black-led, Black-centered social change operates in this context?
In terms of, well, you know, it's interesting. when we work with foundations to talk about investing in Black-led social change groups, we're really just talking about good grant making to some extent. You know, we are an advocate, and I know many in this room probably are, that it's important not to just fund programs, for example, but to fund infrastructure, to provide nonprofit organizations with core operating support. You know, it's still the case that many foundations want to fund the program, i.e. the feeding of children, which is actually really important, but if organizations can't keep the lights on, they can't feed children, you know, and so for foundations, it's still a stretch and a reach to provide just core, basic operating support, right? There are a few foundations that actually do that. I lift up, and because I'm a huge advocate of the Margaret Casey Foundation out in Seattle, Washington, they don't do any program funding whatsoever. They don't do any program funding. They have to believe in your program and that your program matters, but all their dollars go to fund the administration and core support for all of their organizations. They're one of the major, I would say, social justice funders in the country that sort of, in our opinion, get it, so to speak. So there's what this looks like. There's the funding of just the basic infrastructure of social change groups, Black social change groups. It's also a way for foundations to think about sort of how do we design funding strategies. Often, you know, foundations hold the power, and so they in fact are designing their theories of change and designing their grant giving strategies. There are some really interesting models around the country, those that are more explicit in funding movement organizations and social justice organizations, whether they're Black-led or Brown-led, that really invite activists in on the design of grant-making strategies, that invite activists in on decision-making around who gets funding, right? So it's showing up differently in terms of shared decision-making, shared power, and funding, just the core operations of nonprofit infrastructure, social change infrastructure.
Okay, and you also have had examples of, there's a lot of talk about participatory grant-making, but ABFE's been kind of advocating for these things for a long time. There are a lot of books out now that are kind of presenting it as a new thing. What have you found when the grant makers take this approach? How does that affect them in their view of the communities they're serving, and how does that impact these organizations?
You know,
or movements?
Yeah, no, foundations learn a lot. You know, when grant-making professionals actually create the space to learn from those most impacted by the issues that they are interested in funding, they actually learn so much about themselves. You know, and that's what I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges is the lack of accountability. Critical self-reflection is so important for foundations. I've never seen, and I'm not bashing the sector because I think it's critically important, but you know, a group of folks design strategies and programs to solve homelessness and not talk to one homeless person. You know, there's still a lot of that in the sector. So when foundations actually open up the opportunity to hear directly from those impacted and really design based on lived experience, you see things changing in terms of grant-making operations, grant-making policy. I've seen when that happens, all of a sudden the board of the foundation starts to look different, and it invites an inclusive environment, I think, yeah.
So what's the role of multiracial alliances in Black-led social change? How does that work?
Extremely important, and you know, it's so interesting on issues of race in this country how we often get caught in conversations that suggest it's a zero-sum game. Like, you know, if we say Black Lives Matter, somebody's going to say all lives matter, right? But being pro-Black doesn't mean that we're anti-white or anti-Latino or anything else. The literature on multiracial sort of movements suggests that it's important for racial ethnic groups to do their own work and to do cross-racial group work. to move agenda for our community. We actually, and for all communities, we work very closely, for example, with Hispanics in Philanthropy, or HIP is their acronym. And every year, actually, we award a grant to an organization that's doing really important Black-Brown coalition building. And there are a number of examples around the country where organizations understand that multiracial work is important because many of us are just impacted by similar issues, but the impacts might be a bit different based on racial, ethnic, sort of makeup. But there's space and there's need for that. So multiracial work is important, but also intra-group work is extremely important, and there's room for both. It's not an either or. Yeah.
Yeah. So we live in a time now where we see some of the major foundations in the country are led by people of color.
Yeah.
You got Darren Walker at Ford, and Lejeune Ron at Kellogg, and Elizabeth Alexander at Mellon. What does their rise say about this moment in the sector?
It says a lot about them, I have to say. When I think of, and mention two of my mentors and colleagues, Darren at Ford and Lejeune at Kellogg, just knowing those two individuals says a lot about their courage, their patience, their armor in rising up through the ranks. It's often the case, and it's not just for Black professionals in foundations, but also people of color generally in foundations, that we don't tend to rise up. The glass ceiling is real. And we actually have a phrase that we use called the zigzag theory. So if I, Susan Taylor Batten, a Black woman, want to be the president of the foundation that I am now working in, I might have to leave for a little while, right? And then come back. And it's just how it works. And I don't think this is specific to the philanthropic sector. I don't think this is just about how it works in foundations. So it says a lot about the patience, the conviction of folks that do rise up through the ranks within a particular foundation. And Darren and Lejeune are both examples of that. I still believe that what happens in society actually impacts and influences foundations in a major way. Again, I believe the movement for Black Lives really did facilitate the most recent and current conversation we're having about racism and racial equity in this sector. And there's also been a very intentional focus by trustees, particularly Black trustees, to ensure that we're getting more diversity in the C-suite. I think the foundations in California in particular are good examples of this, but it was a deliberate strategy that several foundations took to populate the boardrooms of foundations with people of color, and then ultimately we see the C-suite change and the senior executive teams change. So just a plug for, I think we're often in the foundation world talking about staff and not enough about boards and the role that they play. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned armor, describing your colleagues and rise.
Right.
Yeah, and what they've endured.
I did say armor, didn't I?
You did.
Yeah.
You did. That's very interesting. So let's dig into that, because part of the climate, even though your colleagues have risen, there are others we know have left.
Yeah.
And they've said the reason they've left is because some felt pushed out, some felt a lack of opportunity to really engage with the communities they came to serve.
Yeah.
They talk about isolation. So while we can celebrate these particular examples, we also know something broader is happening elsewhere in the other parts of the organization. So how do we think about all these things?
This is where actually, this is where it gets really interesting. And so we put out a report in 2014 called the Exit Interview. And we talked to about 200 current and former Black program officers around the country. And this came to be, it's interesting how 2014 was just an amazing year, Ferguson. But in my travels around the country, I remember going to the West Coast, talking to a group of Black program officers in the Bay Area, went back to New York, where our offices are located, came back to the Bay Area 8 months later, and half of them were gone, right? And I noticed just that trend around the country. People were leaving, and this was actually before the Council of Foundations that actually keeps the data on the demographics of the sector picked this up. We knew something was going on. So we convened focus groups, we did surveys, as I mentioned, with Black professionals around the country about what was happening. And this was, I think we were here talking with Indiana Blacks in Philanthropy. There are regional Blacks in Philanthropy groups around the country that ABBE networks with very closely. And this is, again, the issues of inclusion. So on the one hand, we're celebrating the fact that Black professionals, and I would say professionals of color, are moving into the CEO position in a number of major foundations in this country. But what folks don't understand and see is that the number of Black staff in the middle is actually dwindling. It's actually dwindling, right? So again, this notion of pipeline and moving up, we lose folks right in the middle. We always say at ABBE, diversity, which is where a lot of the focus is on diversity. We've got to diversify, we've got to diversify. Diversity is necessary but not sufficient to get to equity, right? And we're trying to move the conversations from just being about put people of color in seats or gay and lesbian people in seats and think about the environments that folks are going to work in. And that's a different kind of work. Inclusion work is different than diversity work, right? Diversity is just about representation and ensuring that there are different voices around the table. Inclusion is ensuring that all those voices have power and that they matter. And that's where I think we're struggling in the sector and what folks were saying to us. And sure enough, maybe 2 years after our exit interview report came out, the Council of Foundations recorded the dip in Black program officers for the first time in years. That number had stayed steady and now it's dwindling. So you'll hear in this sector now, which is good, some foundations are starting to sort of move off the diversity conversation and diversity initiatives, and they're starting inclusion initiatives, because that's about sort of, how we make environments more conducive so that diverse voices and perspective matter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that Black-led, Black-centered social change can have the effect of remedying some of these situations over time. What are some other remedies or positions that ABBE is advocating for?
In terms of keeping our attention?
Yeah.
Well, it's why, again, I think our, and this is not a shameless plug, but it's a shameless plug, why organizations like ABBE really do matter. It is, when you talk to the Darrens of the world, when you talk to Lejeune, folks will talk about, when you talk to the Emmett Carsons, and I can go on and on. Willis Bright was a colleague that was here for quite some time. They talk about the importance of having that safe space, a space to network, a space to be authentic and real about working in institutions that perhaps aren't diverse or aren't inclusive. And again, this isn't just endemic to the foundation sector. I mean, in corporate America, we see employee resource groups, race-based employee resource groups, gender-based employee resource groups in corporations around the country. It's the same issue. It's a strategy to keep folks in the field, provide a space where folks can be real, authentic, and I would say heal, and shine up their armor.
Well, to that point, you have previously stated that being in philanthropy, which is a very privileged industry, attempting to raise issues of race and equity is really tough. So it requires a kind of authenticity and vulnerability. So what is the emotional labor here? What is the emotional nature of this work and the toll that it takes on those people?
Oh, wow. When you read that quote, I was like, God, did I say that? Because it's really tough. That is an understatement. Raising issues of race and equity in foundations, really tough. We can't separate ourselves, and I'm just talking about myself and I know colleagues in the ABBE network, from the work that's happening in foundations, right? When we're talking about the good work that foundations do, how to, reduce mass incarceration, we're talking about my family, right? When we're talking about how to reduce the number of kids that is disproportionate, kids of color in foster care, we're talking about my family, right? So what many of our members say, we have about 900 members around the country, is how tough it is to be in these conversations at work, where often the leadership of these discussions, it's not their experience, it's not their sort of reality. Yet, there are many of us in these institutions where, again, we could name the issues, right, around foster care, around mass incarceration, criminalization, these actually issues. We have a proximity to it that we can't step away from. It's not a job, it's actually our life. So the emotional toll is really high and huge. And again, why safe spaces for, and I would say this for any of you all that are in institutions where there's little diversity, sort of how you provide, whether it's identity-based spaces for colleagues to breathe, to heal. I'll never forget, it's July 2016. I unfortunately can't remember which police shooting had just happened. But it was one of those times in this country's history where there was just this rapid media coverage of police shootings of unarmed black men. And I remember getting up that morning, two had happened in a row. And we're ABBFE, we've got to say something. And I couldn't figure out what to say. I was just floored. I mean, I couldn't figure out what to say. And I remember I went into the office, and everybody sort of dragged into the office that morning. And I said, you know what? If we're feeling this way, there are so many other people that feel this way. And let's just put out a call for a virtual healing center. And faster than any registration for any program or webinar that we've ever had, we put out a call, we put out the notice that morning that we're just going to open up the lines at 12 o'clock, whatever time it was, to be. Just to be. We had 300 people sign up just like that. People just needed to, and quite frankly, we didn't do much interaction. I remember we read inspirational quotes. We talked about the history of black people in this country and our strength and our progress. It was all of probably about a half an hour. But I remember, to this day, folks come up to us and say, thank you so much for doing that. I was on the line that day. Thank you so much. So, it's heavy, and we just look for ways to give folks a place to breathe. Yeah.
So, virtual healing circles.
Yeah.
What are some of your personal practices for being present, staying present, and energized for the work?
I leave the country a lot. I actually do. I spend a lot of time in the Caribbean and on the beach.
Beach time.
Water is water is the thing for me. I also say it's not coincidence that I do happen to spend a lot of time out of the country, but in black countries. So I'm almost a resident of Jamaica these days.
Okay.
But I realize that I am going to a place, and I heal in a place that has a very strong history and culture of resistance and pride as it relates to black people and the diaspora. And I truly do. Every 3 months, everyone can tell you I'm out. And I shut it all off, and I don't listen to CNN, and I go to a place where there are televisions and phones, and after about a week, I'm good.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
We're going to open up for questions in a little bit. Let me just ask you again. We have some students in the audience, and we know that breaking into the foundation world can be very difficult.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the advice you would give to students who are interested in the grant-making career in terms of their preparation and trying to make entry into that field.
Well, one, I'm just so thrilled to know a little bit more about the Lilly School and the programs here. So if you're here and you're in this program, I think you're in one of the best programs around the country. So stick with it. Definitely stick with it. Get to know the infrastructure of philanthropy. It's a huge sector. As I said, there are about 70,000 foundations around the country, but there's also infrastructure organizations. ABBFE is one. You name it, there is a organization for it. Grant makers in health, grant makers in education, right? Grant makers in the arts, in addition to all the identity-based philanthropy serving organizations. And we all offer conferences, we all offer webinars, virtual meetings that you can participate in just to augment what you're learning in the classroom, understand a little bit better where foundations are. Some of us have, we don't at ABBFE, but some of these organizations have student memberships, and so I would suggest researching them and making the investment so that you can get in the loop. Because it is sort of a closed sector, but the philanthropy serving organizations in particular, I think, are ways to learn a little more about what's going on. I also just strongly consider that think about spending time, a lot of time, in nonprofit organizations, or what I would say grant receiving organizations. If I had to, again, lift up an area of challenge for foundations, if you're thinking about joining one, what we're still struggling with is understanding and knowing what it takes to run a nonprofit, as basic as that sounds. And so I encourage all folks that want to come into the field just to understand the cycles of nonprofits. We know the cycles of grant-making organizations, but the cycles of nonprofits, what their struggles and challenges are vis-a-vis working with foundations. Those are some things that come to mind.
We also will have community leaders and activists in the audience. So especially since the framework you're promoting is really about challenging grant makers to become more invested in the activists and movements. What would you say to the activists?
This is where I typically, well, could get in trouble. I don't know. First, you know, for the activists and community leaders, take care of yourself. I know that, again, as you know, when we went to Ferguson after Michael Brown was murdered, we were invited in by community. We were asked to come to Ferguson, not by philanthropy and the foundations, but by community leaders. And I got to meet groups like Organization for Black Struggle that, and so many others that have been working on issues of police brutality for many, many years. Again, no paid staff, all volunteers, you know. For 40 years, OBS has been around. And I often wonder, gosh, what if these organizations actually had the resources they need to do the work? You know, where would we be in terms of the issues of police shootings around the country? But I understand and know how hard you work, and just want to just take care of yourselves. The other is that, and this is where it often gets a little interesting and tricky. Foundations have to give away their money. They actually have to give it away. By tax code, they've got to give away 5% of their assets. And you know, as we talk to funders that are investing in Black-led social change groups around the country, they actually have flipped their strategy and are taking cues from community leaders about why their money is good, right? We work with a number of foundations that have said to us, you know, the community-based leadership in our neighborhood don't want to take our money. And I understand why some folks don't want to, it comes with a lot of strings attached, right? But the fact of the matter is, foundations have to give it away. And so recognizing also that I truly believe that, you know, money that's sitting inside of foundation coffers and endowments very much is public money and not necessarily the money of the foundation itself. And so it's just a mind, you know, it's just a flipping of the mind. The last thing I will say is there was a really interesting sort of event that happened in Chicago about 3 or 4 years ago, where I came into town and I had, this was actually the second time this happened, there was a picket line of community leaders in front of one of the major foundations in Chicago. And I thought, yes. That the community leadership there had actually done its own homework, right? Took the 990s and all of the public data about this one foundation's spending and grant-making record, and literally was able to build the story that they were not funding Black-led organizations. They were calling it redlining, foundation redlining, right? And next thing you knew, there was a huge picket line in front of that foundation. I've also seen this happen in another foundation in Seattle as well. I say all that to say that, as I mentioned before, I truly believe that issues of accountability are the biggest issues that we have to tackle with foundations. Again, well-intentioned organizations doing great things, but I'm really looking for ways in which to support community leaders to actually get data in their hands about foundation spending. And once that happens, I've seen some incredible things happen. The story goes in Chicago that foundation in particular started to change its grant-making strategy and move money into organizations that weren't heretofore getting dollars. But it was really the community that took that foundation on about where the dollars are going. So again, just full respect for what leaders are doing to build power in our community, and we just got to find ways to help them hold foundations accountable.
Let's take some questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones that can float, and so we welcome your questions now to talk directly with Susan.
It's a legitimate question, and I would say that the ways in which we've seen it happen really are funders that are investing directly in organizing so that community leaders, neighborhoods themselves can take on schools, can take on the criminal justice system. And why foundations would do this? Clearly, it's not all foundations. There are a group of progressive foundations, social justice foundations, that actually have addressing racism within their broad values and principles. And that's a small, when I talk about 70,000, we're not talking anywhere near that. But there are a small group of progressive funders in this country that literally are focused on undoing racism. And so a lot of it is through investing in organizing. There are other foundations that, a myriad of ways. There are foundations that are taking on this issue of narrative and the stories that are being told about Black people in this country. So for example, the Heinz Endowment in Pittsburgh actually made a commitment to improving outcomes for Black communities in Pittsburgh, and that came with its own struggle and with its own story behind how they got there, also about what had to change at the board level, at the staff level. But they made an investment in improving outcomes for Black men and boys in Pittsburgh. And one of the things that the community actually participation sort of activity suggested was that the main newspaper in Pittsburgh was actually one of the main culprits in Pittsburgh, building a narrative around Black people in that city, which was not accurate. And so the foundation actually worked with community groups to fund a media audit, and actually were able to prove that all of the stories in the main newspaper in Pittsburgh about black people were about two things: crime and sports, right? And you know how these things work with folks that, you know, network on golf courses or whatever. The leadership of the Heinz Endowment actually made connection with the leadership of the newspaper to have a conversation, to present the data, to have a conversation about the inaccurate portrayal of black people that they were actually facilitating in Pittsburgh, right? That if we paint black people as being less than and not of value, we can do all sorts of bad things to them, right? Same about immigrants, I believe, and why we're in the fight around immigrants. If we make everybody think that all immigrants are part of the MS-13 gang and are thugs, we can pass policy that's really anti-immigrant policy. So that work actually led to a change in the kind of storytelling and headlines that newspaper actually was now moving and putting out about black people. So people are attacking it again in a number of ways: directly funding community organizing so communities can take on institutions, schools, police systems, health systems, to address this issue of narrative of what's being told about people of color and black people around the country, building political power to, again, change policy. There are a number of different ways. I'd love to see more foundations in this. And it's also a bit tricky about foundations being in this space, and I understand that as well. But there are some interesting examples going around.
Yeah, we have one up there.
Yes. Hi, Tiara Dungy, enthusiastic PhD student at the Lilly School, Spelman alumna. My question is about the pace of change. So what do you think about the pace of change? What do you say about the pace of change? And for us in the audience, this is a very friendly, self-selected, amazing crowd. But what about the people that didn't self-select to be here? That feel like they're good people because they're in philanthropy, and feel like they've done enough or are doing enough, but we still have to have these conversations. What do you recommend we do about that? Are we slowing down? Are we pushing harder? What's your advice?
So, you know, the pace of change, I think, you know, depends very much on the needle we're trying to move. And you know, what comes to mind is some work that a number of foundations supported in Baltimore, again, directly investing in parent groups that were concerned about the disproportionate suspension of black boys from schools in Baltimore. And quite frankly, investment by about 3 funders over the course of 5 years actually showed significant change, and not only reduction of suspension rates, but increases in graduation rates for black boys. So I think the issue of pace depends on the needle we're trying to move. I do think that foundations struggle with issues of pace. Things have to be done in grant cycles, which is not the way, you know, life works and life happens. So that's one of the challenges in terms of addressing issues of racism when foundations get into this space. Again, there are foundations that are more aligned, progressive, that understand that change, again, is not linear. You know, it's not something that's going to happen in the grant cycle. You can't do it with a 2-year grant either. So we're constantly trying to raise this issue about long-term investments, multi-year investments, investments not just on program, but in people and core support, so organizations can do their work. We also are always talking about who's not in the room, and I mean, I think that also raises a responsibility for us. There's a part of me, you know, when we organize a conversation with foundations around addressing racism and their own racism, right, in their institutions, it used to be the case that I would get upset if only 5 people were in the room. I actually can't let that stop me. There's a saying that someone once said to me, we have what we need in the room right now, right? And how do we actually use the folks that are in the room right now? So I think it's incumbent on all of us to understand and know who's not here and who's going to talk to them, right? Who's actually going to sort of nudge, talk to, engage, and invite folks that we think should be in these conversations that aren't here. This is, you know, for us in the foundation space about organizing as well. There's a core group that we know are very intentional around addressing issues of race and equity. And we're always strategizing, right, about who do you know, who's in your network, do the power analysis, you know, we got the tools in terms of who's moving big money in the sector and who's going to go get it, right? Who's the messenger that actually can actually bring them in. So I think it's a constant, you know, task. Shouldn't slow us down, but, you know, tending to how we continue to build the circle, I think is a constant task. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Susan, you're one of my she-rolls, and it's an honor and a privilege to have you here. As you know, I was one of the founders of Indiana Blacks in Philanthropy back when I was with the then Center on Philanthropy. Right. And it was frustrating to listen to you talk about the challenges with equity and inclusion in 2019 as we were having the same conversations in 2009 and in 1999 and 79, on and on and on. So my question really simply is, if you could supernaturally change one criterion, one factor to affect a meaningful, lasting, positive change, whether we're talking about inclusion or the percentage of dollars that go to social justice work in African American communities, what would that one factor or criterion be?
Wow, Larry, I can't get three, huh? You know, I think it would have something to do with the tax structure in philanthropy. I think once we start talking about messing with money, that's a technical way of saying, and the extent to which foundations are allowed to organize and hold wealth in this country and tax policy that allows them to do this, I'm truly going to lose some members on this one. I'd go there. We're doing some work now around looking at who manages the money in foundations, right? So most of you all know, many of you might know the structure of foundations that endowed foundations actually only have to give away 5% of their assets every year. So often, our focus is on that 5% and where that money is going, and we're very focused on that. The real money is in the endowment, right? I always say foundations, to some extent, are like, you know, investment firms on Wall Street that do a little grant making on the side, honestly, right? And so there have been a couple of attempts, including AB 624 that you are aware of, sort of attempts in places like California that would impact the extent to which foundations are allowed to hold wealth. I think there are pros and cons to those kinds of strategies, to tell you the truth. But when we're talking about addressing where the real wealth is, I think we're moving in a territory that has been protected for a privileged class for quite some time in this country. The one other thing, I'm just going to take one more letter, is that issues of transparency, I think, are extremely important. At this point, you know, there isn't a requirement that foundations have to say who they're hiring in terms of race and ethnicity, who really is getting their money, unless some group actually studies it, like the group in Chicago did. And there have been attempts to actually legislate requirements for foundations to do that, and bills were killed faster than, you know, my goodness. So if there was a way to actually put some requirements around transparency of who gets hired and where money goes. I think that would change trajectory as well. And I will say, on both of those fronts, there are things in the works.
Is there a question here? Yeah. There, okay. Go ahead. Then we'll come over here.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kristen. So I'm here because I am one of the first players for Indianapolis Red, which is a new professional women's ultimate frisbee team. And so we are in the making of creating a professional league called the Premier Ultimate League for non-binary players to recruit non-binary players and women to play ultimate frisbee professionally. So we are looking to have a local conversation on equity and gender equity and inclusion and race. And as someone who has never led a conversation like that, I was wondering if you had some pointers on how to start that conversation.
The good news is that, I thought Tyrone was saying, I'll help you. Okay. Yeah. You know, one, I would say the good news is that there are a lot of resources I know right here in Indianapolis that actually can help you think about how to start that conversation. I will say, and this is a bias, but I think a bias that's backed by research and a lot of literature. If you're looking to start a conversation around equity, and you mentioned gender and you mentioned race, I would center race in those discussions because of the dynamics of race and the way in which it intersects with other isms and forms of oppression. You know, you've got to know a bit about sort of why you're doing it. You know, one, two, we want to ensure that the sort of conversation starts with, again, folks with lived experience, so that if you're talking about women and this, you know, engagement or sport, or people of color and this engagement of sport, you start with them about how to open up opportunity for them to be, you know, a part of the activity moving forward. Those are, yeah, some of the things that I would suggest. But whenever we're talking about racial equity and folks mention gender, sexual orientation, and all the other, again, forms of identity that are extremely important, I just suggest to you to center race in the middle of that conversation. Yeah.
Let's come over here.
I'm curious of your personal perspective around the issue of the resurgence of white supremacy nationally and internationally, and how would you compare that to other times in either American or global history?
Wow, I know. You know, I don't know that I see it. Well, that's not true. I was going to say, I don't know that I see it much differently over the course of time. I think, you know, it takes different forms, white supremacy, different forms. We clearly, though, you know, whether it's Charlottesville or, you know, we are at a time in this country where we've got leadership and issues and dynamics in Washington that I think are supporting the resurgence and boldness, right, of supremacy and white privilege. Nationalism, I think, hides, you know, the real sort of issues in conversation and focus on white supremacy. So not that, and you didn't say this, that it's ever gone away, but clearly leadership in this country, I believe, has facilitated a boldness around these issues that is unprecedented for me. I mentioned when I got off the plane in Nashville, and and seeing things that I'd never seen before. We used to take the bus, a group of us from Nashville to New York, and couldn't get off the bus in Pulaski, Tennessee, right, where the bus drivers told us to sit tight. My freshman year at Fisk, I don't know if you remember this, AJ, the Klan marched right along, right alongside campus, and I'm straight out of New York, and I, never seen anything like that. So I remember that stuff. But I will say, with what's in the White House, I didn't say it that way, what's in the White House, I realized that I'm threatened, I'm scared. I was mentioning to someone today, I was meeting with colleagues from the Community Foundation here in Indiana, and ABFE, along with, and many of you perhaps maybe in this room, we have received our fair share of hacks and threats and direct communication to us, our leadership, our board, and that is different. The organization's been around for quite some time, and I've been there for 10 years. And I would say within the last 4 to 5 years, we are concerned about security in ways in which we never have been before. This national research that we have out with Black-led organizing groups around the country, we can't get many of them to respond to our surveys, and they say it's because of security. We can't give you the information about who we are and what we do because we're under threat. So that is different. So that is different. I was going to say I don't know how we get out of it, but I think I know how we get out of it. Yeah, that is different.
We'll make this the last question.
Hi, Susan. The question I have is, you spoke a little bit about it before, but how do individuals who work with nonprofit organizations that aren't in philanthropic organizations, how can they work in conjunction with ABFE and also individuals? Because the largest form of activity is individual donors. Yeah. So how can individuals who are philanthropic want to give back work with ABFE in regards to what you're doing if they're not in a traditional foundation setting?
Yeah, so thanks, Tarun. We actually, I was mentioning to someone earlier today, probably in 2011, we actually made an intentional effort to broaden our tent. So historically, we have been about trying to change grant-making institutions, right, and working with folks that work in foundations. But in 2011, we passed a new vision for the organization that goes something like this. ABFE is central to a movement of grant makers, donors, and nonprofits to improve outcomes for Black communities and the country as a whole. And I say that to say, we know that there is opportunity and need to organize philanthropists, and philanthropists, in the many forms in which philanthropy comes. We talk about time, talent, and treasure. Often people are talking about the treasure or the money part. But we're talking about time, talent, and treasure. So we're looking to do more organizing of donors. Our membership, and I will say this to nonprofits in the room, our membership is open to nonprofits, to Black-led nonprofits. Many of the groups like ABFE don't open their membership to nonprofit leaders. But we think we can't just have foundations talking to foundations about how to help Black communities when the folks that are really doing the work, which are the nonprofit leaders, aren't in the room. So we've actually made a push over the last several years. Our nonprofit membership is probably the fastest growing sort of part of our membership base. So we want nonprofits at the table and we want donors at the table. At the end of this month is our first meeting of Black family foundations around the country. We actually haven't convened Black family foundations before. I was speaking with, and I know something's happening right after this meeting, where there's a Black fund emerging right here in Indiana. We've now identified Black funds at about 20 community foundations around the country. We're going to bring them together at our annual conference in Detroit. So I say that to say, please see us as a resource. We're actually growing our capacity to be able to support donors in a new way. And one of the reasons why I wanted to move our work around philanthropic advising is because I think that is the role that we can play. We're working with a number of Black family foundations now, helping them think through their grant-making strategy. And as you say, the majority of philanthropy in this country is individual philanthropy. So we have to ensure that there's space and opportunities for organizing in that regard. So see us as a resource there.
And on that note, Susan Batten, thank you very much.
Thank you.